Hey everyone, once more welcome or maybe welcome back to our AZ-801 Configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. My name is Peter Detender and I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer. In this module, we're going to tackle that topic of monitoring and troubleshooting Windows Server. And as you know, we typically have one topic that we spread across two different modules. One module is zooming in on what it looks like from a Windows Server perspective, typically the on-prem variation of it. And then in the second one, and that's going to be this module, we're going to touch on the same topic, monitoring, troubleshooting, but now bringing in a little bit of that Azure capability. Out of this module, I have 4 different sections I want to walk you through. The first one is pretty easy, monitoring your Windows Server virtual machines when they run in Azure, but also bringing in a little bit of hybrid in that scenario. Second one is monitoring your virtual machines, where we're going to move away from just monitoring an individual VM and bringing it into a broader Azure monitoring capability called Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. And then the second part of the module is spread across 2 different troubleshooting topics. First one is overall sharing some tips and tricks where I think we cannot really cover all possible scenarios, but sharing some highlights like the most common cases that we expect where you could use some help in troubleshooting Windows servers running as Azure virtual machines. And then last, closing with some hybrid networking troubleshooting tips and tricks as well. So with that, I would say, let's get started. Now, what does it mean to monitor your Windows servers running as Azure virtual machines or maybe even running as hybrid VMs? Not the biggest section, I would say, because my assumption is that, first of all, you went through that previous module. So a lot of what it takes to monitor your Windows servers, in the end, it doesn't really matter where they're running. So what this topic is going to cover primarily is how to use the built-in Azure monitoring capabilities to continue monitoring your environment. Now, the magic little piece here, I would say, is called Azure Monitor. Now, Azure Monitor, I like to describe it as an umbrella product name for a lot of different monitoring capabilities. Now, out of the highlight of the course, touching on Windows servers and not only the on-prem part, but also the hybrid part, it means that we're only going to talk about like a small subset of what Azure Monitor gives you. So don't get it wrong that it's only available for monitoring your virtual machines, because in the end, it might end up becoming your new overall Azure, but also hybrid and on-prem monitoring capability. So it's giving you a lot of, I would say, expected traditional monitoring capabilities, allowing you to check metrics like how is my resource in Azure, how is it behaving, what CPU load, memory load, all the way to everything that's running in Azure, but that's no longer running as a virtual machine. So you're going to use it to do some quick and easy validation, like there's a CPU load, I'm going to validate, but you could also drill down in what we call a deeper infrastructure monitoring, as well as checking your applications. Got a few screenshots here coming up, and you already know, if it's not the only module you're watching, that Peter likes to talk about it, because I like sharing things with learners, making sure that you get that skill set up and running, but also showing you things, because that's where demos could sometimes be more clarifying or even more descriptive, and just giving you comfort. Like, I understand what it's doing, but I think it's always nice to show you. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the screenshots, but in short, as I mentioned, it allows you to, for example, monitor your virtual machines and really think about everything that it takes to monitor your virtual machines end to end. Keep in mind that it's running as an Azure VM, which means that you won't get access to insights from the hypervisor or even the physical layer. But anything starting from the network, storage, and obviously everything that runs on the virtual machine layer, Windows and Linux, pretty obvious, you will be able to monitor using Azure Monitor. Now, if you have this hybrid scenario where you have workloads running in Azure, then maybe out of a migration project, maybe just out of the fact that you want to use a hybrid scenario, or maybe there's some necessity to start integrating your cloud environment into your on-prem, it now means that maybe you have two different or maybe a couple of different monitoring tools already in place. Why? Because in your on-prem environment, you're going to monitor the network, the physical servers, storage, the virtual machines, Hyper-V or VMware based, and then on top of that, everything that you run inside your virtual machine workload. Now, by moving your workloads into cloud, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden you can just migrate everything. Now, the nice thing here with Azure Monitor is that you can actually deploy what we call the monitoring agent, and it allows you to slightly bring in monitoring metrics from your on-prem environment into your cloud environment. A big reason there is because some of your workloads might actually run in a hybrid topology where an easy example, it could be that a web application workload is already running in an Azure VM, but the database backend, maybe some file servers, maybe some other components out of the application stack might still be running on-prem, where you want to get that full topology view, and that's a little bit what the screenshot here is trying to illustrate. Other options, everything we already talked about. In the end, if your virtual machine is running, it doesn't really matter where it's running. So what this means here is that everything we touched on in the other previous module, if you went through that, you need to monitor CPU state, memory state, disk read-write operations, like anything to validate how the virtual machine is running. And now obviously you can do all that from within an Azure Virtual Machine perspective. And then last, one of the other options you have is Azure Arc and Windows Admin Center. We didn't really talk about Azure Arc that much throughout the course, but Azure Arc, every now and then we briefly touched on it, right? Where it's that bridging service, that's where the name comes from, allowing you to manage and treat your on-prem or hybrid running workloads as if they were Azure virtual machines. They show up in the portal, they don't run in an Azure data center, but the way you're going to manage them, the way you're going to monitor them is quite identical thanks to that Azure Arc integration. The other option that I'll walk you through is Windows Admin Center, where I used it in so many other modules as part of my demos, where now I can show you, you could easily deploy this from within Azure itself. So actually optimizing a lot of the scenarios. And that's really that hybrid aspect of it, where you're just going to look into your environment and it doesn't really matter anymore where your servers are running. Now, when we think about Azure monitoring, what does it actually mean, right? Now, one of the, I would say, main components is looking at logging and validating more inside information. Logging, I assume for everyone, is pretty straightforward. It means that, for example, you're going to use Event Viewer, you're going to capture specific logging information out of your application, and whenever something goes wrong, although Peter gave you the advice to not only look into those logs and audits only when something goes wrong, but just overall, I would say make that Azure monitoring or overall monitoring just a best practice that you would look into like almost every day. And then if you need to drill down on some specifics, like we can see that there is like a CPU spike, or we're running out of storage capacity a lot faster than what we sized for, that's where you could start looking into virtual machine insights. So it's going to give you a lot more details, allowing you to drill down, if you want, on a lot of the monitoring aspects. Like you can look into events, you can look into data, you can look into CPU load, memory load, overall usage, what's the reliability of my virtual machine, and so much more. That's all popping up in the virtual machine insights out of the Azure Monitor console as part of the Azure portal. I think I talked enough about what Azure Monitor could look like, so I guess it's more than time to jump into my demo environment again and showing you a little bit of what it takes to monitor an Azure virtual machine, showing you some of the single VM monitoring approach, and then quickly jumping into Azure Monitor capabilities, where technically the backend is relying on what we call Log Analytics Workspace. But that will become clear as part of my demo. So with that, let's have a look at some of the Azure resources monitoring capabilities, where I mainly want to show you how to monitor your Azure running VMs, but also hybrid running VMs, talking a little bit about Azure Monitor, talking about insights, and log analytics, and how all that can help you monitoring your totality of your environment, cloud-based and hybrid-based. So let me switch back to one of my demo VMs here, where I'm going to open up my virtual machine. And then obviously I always describe the portal as a monitoring tool on its own. Why? Because you got a lot of information already from the portal. You can see that in this case, my virtual machine is running. I can pull up my network information. I can drill down on more network details, and the same here. I switch to monitoring, and it's going to show me like pretty high level view of my CPU, disk read write, and virtual machine availability. Actually, if you were here in one of the other modules, this is almost the cloud-based replacement for performance monitor, reliability monitor, and resource monitor, which now means that you don't have to log on to your Windows machine anymore. Whether you log on to the server or you do remote management, it's all part of the Azure portal experience. You can drill down on more statistics by moving down here in the resource and selecting the monitoring pane. If you go to Insights, it's going to allow you to read more information about your virtual machine. So what we need to do here is enabling it. And what it's going to ask me is like, hey, where do you want to store this information? We talked about data collection sets in the on-prem scenario, and this is basically the cloud alternative to it. It's going to create a workspace, or obviously if you already have one, you could point to an existing one. And that's all it takes. Where now it's going to start collecting more detailed information. Other options we have is metrics, where again, it's about the same as Performance Monitor, where we have our node and we can loop through different metrics. So if I'm interested in disk read write operations or IOPS, I can add more metrics, where now I'm interested in CPU load, and I might be adding, I don't know, some memory statistics. There we go. And basically doing all this for my virtual machine. Now imagine that I want to get more details. I can now also activate diagnostic settings. So what you get with diagnostic settings is, first of all, you need to enable it. It's going to ask you like, where do you want to store like a storage account? And from there, it's going to give you a lot more details. So you have all possible performance counters that we already talked about multiple times. It allows you to capture logs, like moving the built-in Windows event logs, duplicating them into storage. So the use case here is obviously a little bit more towards troubleshooting. One of the topics I'll talk about all the way at the end, but I can already talk about it from a monitoring perspective, where you can capture logging information. So imagine that your Windows VM is no longer running or it's not reachable. It means that from here, you could actually still troubleshoot, looking into the logging, even when the server is no longer available or running or reachable. You can do event tracing. So what this means is getting that tracking log, like not just a one-time shot, but actually defining like provider class, like I want system views, I want warnings for them. That's mainly what we get here. And then allowing you to do trend analysis. Crash dumps is pretty convenient if your server is not starting up like the Windows blue screen already during the boot phase. You can capture those as well. So all of that from diagnostic settings. Now, up till now in this part of the story, I was focusing on one single VM. Now, if we need to troubleshoot more VMs, what you would do is probably looking into more details, doing the same from a different VM, opening up insights, opening up metrics, and looking for the same. That's exactly where now Azure Monitor comes in. So what you can do is moving to Monitor, and that's that higher level monitoring capability. I cannot go through all the details here because there's way too much, and I only got a couple of minutes to wrap up this demo. But you can see that it's starting with insights. So the same what I mentioned before, but now on a different level. Virtual machine insights, network insights, centralizing metrics, configuring alerts, like instead of the reactive approach, you could now move to proactive, like if something goes wrong, which could be a warning, which could be critical, then I want you to send me that notification. Similar to what we talked about with a Defender for Cloud already. Biggest section I want to highlight here is log analytics. So what's the idea behind log analytics? It's using that custom query language, and that's going to help you in Defender for Cloud. I briefly touched on it. In Sentinel, briefly touched on it. But it's basically allowing you to create your own custom queries to pull up information about your environment. You can do application-specific logging. You can do audit logging. You can pull up Azure metrics. All that information gets stored in a log analytics data backend. Think of it as a massive database with different tables, and all your information is getting stored in there. And then from there, obviously, it's going to allow you to pull up that information. Now, I just grabbed the scenario here, like run some user queries. And as you can see here, it's suggesting a little query syntax. But this would take me probably like a day to get you through all this. So mainly touching on some of the characteristics instead of being able to drill down on all the details. So I guess that's it from a high level. I helped you understanding what it takes to monitor a standalone virtual machine, and the same approach is valid for other Azure resources. Talked about the diagnostic logging, where it's going to allow you to export events to an external storage account, and then bringing everything together in Azure Monitor with a huge amount of capabilities. Let's move back to the presentation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about boot diagnostics. Good, so that part worked, but it's not the only option yet. Now, what we're going to do here is just continuing talking about even more Azure monitoring capabilities. What's the big difference? Up till now, we looked into overall health state of the virtual machines, assuming that the virtual machine is running and then opening up like CPU load, memory load, and maybe interacting with other parts of your application workload architecture. What we're going to do in this section is drilling down on a little bit more specifics, validating the health using health monitoring, checking boot diagnostics, which pop up whenever you're starting the virtual machine or restarting the virtual machine, where now you can capture some of that boot up start phase as well. Drilling down on specific virtual machine metrics, where technically it's all part of the Azure platform, but behind the scenes, it's using the traditional Windows Performance Monitor to send a lot of that information. Like all the metrics are basically showing up in Azure Monitor. So again, not too hard, I guess, because monitoring to me still feels like one of those more common scenarios. Once you start working as an admin, a server admin, or a cloud admin, most probably the monitoring is one of the first tasks you have to go through. So another screenshot here to illustrate just a little bit what we're going to talk about in the demo, but it's showing you virtual machine metrics. You can do a little bit of trend analysis, typically for like the last 24 hours, 7 days, sometimes up to 30 days. And that's where log analytics would allow you to store information with a longer retention. Now I showed you just a couple of metrics out of my previous demo, but don't get fooled that those are the only ones. There's actually an extensive amount of metrics already part of the platform, like meaning out of Windows Server, what I showed you in the other module with Performance Monitor, where now a lot of those monitoring information, like the real telemetry information if you want, is becoming available to Azure Monitor. So this slide here gives you a nice category view. What about CPU metrics, operating system disk, data disk, and network state? Now, the nice thing is, as you can imagine, given the fact that we have customizable graphs, you can now bring in all that information from a single VM, from multiple VMs. Later on, you might look into using virtual machine metrics together with non-virtual machine metrics, and that's really what that Azure Monitor is about. Got a few more screenshots here, so you already know, not going to spend a lot of time in them, but showing you in a demo what they actually could look like. But just know that you can customize all possible dashboards you have You can create your own KPIs like key performance indicators, or even looking into full data analysis, where as the wrap up of this section, we want to showcase like 3 different, more specific monitoring scenarios. One example here is DDoS attacks. Now, DDoS is nothing specific to Azure running workloads, but out of the platform, you do have that DDoS protection baked in. So no surprise that you can open up your Azure Monitor and you can look into DDoS attacks specifically. Another example is CPU load. One of those more common scenarios where your server is slowing down, creating some or experiencing some bottleneck, and one of them could be CPU, one of them could be memory. That's mainly what we want to emphasize here. So what you're going to do is open up your virtual machine, jump into Azure Monitor, or opening up Azure Monitor and selecting the virtual machine, and then start looking into all those details. Initially, when the problem occurs, you're going to open it up, and then again, remember that the information is not just static when you just start looking into it, but it's also keeping a state over the last 24 hours, 7 days, up to 30 days. And if you extend it with log analytics workspaces, you can define your own data retention as well. And then last, one of the other items here is the alerting again, where I'm going to walk you through some additional configuration options in the action groups, allowing you to define notifications using email. That's what I'll show you. But you could also extend with like an SMS text message gateway or interacting with other third-party incident or service management tools. Now, one of the last slides here in this little topic is a little segue to, I would say, the more advanced monitoring and logging scenarios. Because if you remember what I talked about at the start of the module, Azure Monitor is based on log analytics workspaces. So technically what we're doing, and again, as a trainer, I like to simplify complex things, right? You have log analytics, that's like the data endpoint, the storage endpoint if you want, for all that telemetry information. What you're going to do with Azure Monitor is pulling up information in those easy understandable views, maybe customizing your own views, and that's where behind the scenes, having some more advanced experience with custom query language could be beneficial. Custom query language is like a SQL, T-SQL-alike language where you're basically going to use it, like look into this massive workspace, log analytic workspace backend, and I'm going to use you to retrieve information. Find all telemetry information you have on a specific server from a specific date across like the full Azure environment. So pretty powerful, but again, don't want to step out of the core content that we need to cover. You can probably continue your own learning on learn.microsoft.com and searching for custom query language examples, where I think we could basically spend like 1 or more days just training you on custom query language. But we didn't want to leave it out, so keep that in mind as well. Next little section here is not just about monitoring, but also a little bit more about troubleshooting. And I think those two topics obviously are always going nice hand in hand, because when something goes wrong, when you need to troubleshoot, you're typically going to rely on monitoring to help you providing more insights. So what I'm going to cover in this section is overall a little bit, and again, don't get fooled, these are not the only troubleshooting skills you should have. It's just a listing of the more common ones. A lot of things can go wrong, and there's so many dependencies, so obviously I cannot cover all of them in just a couple of minutes as part of one module, but we're going to cover a little bit about virtual machine deployments, like where can it go wrong during the deployment of the VM. Maybe you deployed it correctly, but it's not starting up for whatever reason, so you can do some troubleshooting there. The virtual machine might be deployed successful, might run fine, like starting up, but then you might not be able to connect to it. And that's where we're going to emphasize one other option to optimize network connectivity. Instead of directly connecting to the public internet using like RDP, remote desktop, we can now integrate a service called Azure Bastion. And then last, closing the topic with troubleshooting some around performance, and a little bit around storage. So I would say let's jump in and just covering each and every of those possible scenarios in one slider placeholder. So troubleshooting virtual machine deployment. Again, there's so many reasons where it could go wrong, but overall we identify two different ones here. Resolving upload errors. What this means is you might have like a Windows image, you're going to use the Azure portal, maybe you're going to migrate virtual machine disks, and you find out that it's not always working. You could check network, you could check the permissions, that's mainly what it comes down to. Next to that, you might have like what we call resolving capture errors, which means you have your Windows machine, you have it generalized, which means we're going to remove all the machine specifics and using it as an image to redeploy more virtual machines, where again, out of that whole process, a lot of things could actually go wrong. Some other side notes here on the deployment. Again, make sure you got the permissions right. Make sure you got the Azure regions, because you might have a challenge with virtual machine sizes where not all sizes are available across all Azure regions. And next to that, obviously, always know what you're doing. Maybe taking a step before the deployment is also deciding how you deploy. Nothing wrong with deploying from the portal, but it might be more optimized if you need to do a lot of deployments to look into command line, PowerShell, or CLI, and even better, maybe looking into infrastructure as code using template-based deployment. The other option is, or troubleshooting scenario, is where the virtual machine is running in Azure, but for some reason it's not starting up. Or maybe it's been running, you trigger a restart, and it's no longer coming up. Now that's where, first of all, you could try and check the boot diagnostics. If you didn't enable them yet, I could only share the recommendation to maybe consider enabling boot diagnostics for all your Azure virtual machines. You might look into Azure Serial Console, which means that you can actually connect to the virtual machine before it's actually running. So giving you that little interface, just like you would connect to a physical machine in a physical data center. Again, a lot of things can go wrong during the boot phase, but like BitLocker, disk encryption, it's not finding the keys. The traditional Windows blue screens when it tries to start a device or a service and it's not recognized, it's not starting up, and it might trigger a blue screen. And then another one, since we touched on Windows Update in one of our first modules here in the course, maybe it's having a pending update, maybe the update didn't load correctly, and that might also give you some challenges. Another pretty common scenario when dealing with Azure virtual machines is virtual machine extensions. So we talked about extensions already in another module, so not going to repeat all of that. But when you think about integrating Network Watcher, when you think about, for example, configuration management, integrating other plugins, that's really what we're doing, using some scripted deployments of server using desired state configuration, all of those are based on virtual machine extensions. So the process is that you're going to start the deployment of the virtual machine, and when the virtual machine deployment is complete, it's going to bring in those extensions, where obviously you can imagine, again, quite some things could potentially go wrong. Not saying that extensions are not reliable, but we all know that it's just what happens in real life, and that's where you can dive in some specific troubleshooting. The benefit might be that the virtual machine is actually running. It might not have the extension, it might not have the workload that you expect, but it should maybe be possible to connect to the VM and do some validation, some troubleshooting from within the virtual machine itself. But what if you cannot connect to the virtual machine? That's what we're emphasizing here. So what this means is that, again, network-wise, we talked about Azure networking, we talked about NSG's network security groups, or Azure Firewall, or maybe you have third-party firewall appliances running in Azure, and you try to connect to the VM and it's not working. Could be out of your application workload. Obviously, it could also be from your admin perspective, where in this scenario, what we mainly describe here is you try to connect to the VM remote management using RDP or the Linux SSH, but since it's a Windows course, we mainly talk about Windows RDP, right? And that's where you can have a long list of reasons why you could not connect to it. I would say maybe start with validating if the virtual machine is running. Next to that, check if the virtual machine gets an IP address allocated. Is it a static IP, dynamic IP? And then next, what about my firewalling? Think back about the firewalling within the virtual machine itself, out of the Windows Defender firewall security. Next, check NSGs, ASGs, and maybe Azure Firewall. Like those would really be the different layers I would try to go through myself in case of troubleshooting connectivity. Now, to help you with a lot of that, what about firewalling? What about opening up RDP and all of that? There is actually another service in the platform that you could consider to make some of that RDP-like experience a lot more easy to deploy, but also even a lot more secure. That service is Azure Bastion. I didn't emphasize it, but every now and then, depending obviously on the demo I was doing, you might have noticed that I'm using RDP in the browser. It's not the only capability of Azure Bastion, but by design, if you look a bit at this diagram here, the way it works is you deploy Azure Bastion as a service. It's part of Azure, it's not running on a VM, it's just a service in the platform. You need to deploy a specific subnet, so you're going to create an Azure Bastion subnet inside your Azure Virtual Networking, and from there you define the routing, the topology across your virtual network. There was a time in the early days of Azure Bastion, a couple of years ago in meantime, where each and every Bastion could only connect to one single subnet and VNet, where now you can actually use it across multiple VNets. If you have like VNet peering in place, connecting from one VNet to the other, that would also be possible through that Bastion route. Now, the biggest reason for using Bastion is that your virtual machines no longer need a public IP address, which obviously is a big security optimization. So the way it works, you deploy your virtual machines just like any other virtual machine deployment. You're going to add at least one or more Bastion hosts in front of it, and from there you can connect to the virtual machines. So instead of doing direct RDP, as we call it, you would now select Bastion. And again, I'll show you in a demo what that actually looks like. The additional level of security that I like to emphasize is that you preferably connect to the Azure portal first before you're going to open up like Bastion to connect to the virtual machine. Now, it's totally off topic, but if you know that we have Entra ID and we do have conditional access and multi-factor authentication, it now means that your admins first have to go through MFA, through conditional access, before they reach the Azure portal. And that's a big step up from a security perspective before they can even RDP into the virtual machine. So a lot of really cool things about Bastion there. A little bit more on the troubleshooting, but wrapping it up. Virtual machine performance. We talked about Performance Monitor on the Windows level in a previous module, so everything we talked about at that time is still more than valid for Azure VMs. But now remember that preferably instead of you connecting to the virtual machine using RDP, why not relying on Azure Monitor to help you with that? The monitoring piece is one aspect, and you're going to use the monitoring feedback to maybe try and do some troubleshooting. So that's why we're emphasizing it again here. Same for storage, same for networking. So there's a lot of possibilities where I would say the baseline is that you're going to use the monitoring information to continue or maybe start your troubleshooting sequence. Last little highlight here on storage is that Azure provides you managed disks. That's the default in meantime, like creating virtual disks, but you might also have what we call unmanaged disks, and that's where you deploy a virtual machine connecting to a storage account. Now you can migrate from unmanaged to managed, and again, that might bring in some challenges. You might have performance issues based on the fact that you maybe did not select the correct storage environment backend for the virtual machine or the virtual machine workload, and that's mainly what we just want to highlight here as well. So with that, I'm going to jump to some other demonstrations here. First of all, showing you where a deployment could go wrong, for as far as I can just come up with one or two possible issues, showing you a bit on the virtual machine extensions and how you could troubleshoot them, and then the same for connectivity and storage. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of possible reasons or different scenarios where it requires Azure Virtual Machine troubleshooting. So I don't have the time, and that's obviously not at all the intention, to cover all possible scenarios. So out of the presentation, we had overall VM deployment troubleshooting, highlighting virtual machine extensions, a little bit on connectivity, where we positioned Bastion, and I'll show you that as well. So one of the first scenarios, I would say, when something goes wrong, at least as part of the virtual machine deployment, well, maybe it's literally linked to the Azure Resource Manager or Bicep deployment that you're using. So to show you a bit what that could look like from a troubleshooting perspective, so in my case, I navigated to one of my resource groups where I moved into deployment, and over here you can see that it created like a lot of different resources for my demo environments throughout the course using Azure templates. Now, during one of those deployments, as you can see, most of the deployments were fine, but then all of a sudden it started failing. So what you can do from here is during or after the deployment, going into the virtual machine option here, because that's where my virtual machine deployment was failing, and it's going to provide you a description. Now, in this case, it tells me like, hey, you tried to connect to a network interface and it was not found, which could be a timeout, which could be maybe some issue in the template, like a naming convention. And then what you can do from here is, again, looking into the error details and moving to the raw error format, and that's going to give you the JSON description. Every now and then, you have to jump a little bit from the red bar with the error message all the way into the raw error. So that's, I would say, mainly the deployment, apart from just reading the console, apart from if you deploy through the portal, obviously making sure that all your settings are captured correctly. Another option is the virtual machine extensions. So what this means is if I go to like my web server that I'll use in one of my other demos, extensions are little plugins that allow you to inject information into an Azure virtual machine. So in this example, I'm using desired state configuration, which is the PowerShell DSC, which you can run in your on-prem Windows Server environment or Linux even. And what I'm doing here, since it's a web server, I basically use template-based deployment with infrastructure as code. Once the virtual machine got deployed in Azure, I'm using a PowerShell script to install IaaS and to deploy a web server. Now, that could be one of the reasons where the virtual machine deployment worked fine, but anything within the VM is no longer working, or like in this case, maybe desired state configuration has a challenge. You can do the monitoring now. I don't have a failed error. I always like to show you that things are actually working fine, although maybe in a troubleshooting section, I might reconsider that for another course. But that's, I would say, pretty much it on extensions. Other interesting aspect we have in troubleshooting is obviously in the operations section, where you can validate like what is the change that happened on my server, a bit on inventory, what Azure policy might or might not be allocated to this machine, checking overall what the health of the VM looks like or any other resource. It's not just VMs. And then specifically for VMs, you also have the run command. So the run command allows you to interact with the server in a lot of different ways. Like imagine you cannot connect to the server. By the way, I'll talk about this in the next couple of seconds. What could be a possible scenario there? But running like ipconfig, running remote PowerShell, you could all trigger that from here. So imagine I want to run ipconfig. It's super intuitive to use, where you're just going to execute the command, but instead of you RDPing into the server or SSHing, if it's a Linux machine, it already has a few of those pre-built commands in there. It typically takes about a minute before this is going to show up. And then over here in the console, you will see the outcome of it. You can run your own PowerShell script. So instead of, again, logging onto the server, you could now copy and paste your PowerShell script in here, or maybe even better, look into like Azure Automation, where you could centralize runbooks to run PowerShell scripts. It's still working on it, but I guess you got the idea. Oh, there we go. So this is literally executing ipconfig on the local machine. And then obviously from here, you could validate where things might or might not be in order. Now we touched on connectivity, and as part of the presentation, we highlighted like RDP is an option, SSH is an option. We talked about firewalls, we talked about NSGs all the way at the start of the course, but preferably I would recommend using Bastion. So what is Bastion? If I go to my domain controller that I used throughout the course for most of my demos, Bastion is that jump server-alike scenario, but it's not running as a VM. It's running as a cloud service. And you basically connect to a specific subnet in the same VNet than where your servers are running. From here, you need to provide your admin credentials. And in my case, since it's a domain controller, I'm going to log on with the domain admin credentials. And from there, open in a new browser, you do connect, and the outcome is I can manage my servers through the browser. It's not the only benefit we have out of the browser, but it's definitely convenient and maybe even more convenient. Like I mentioned, since it requires browser authentication, it would also allow you to bring in Entra ID, MFA, and conditional access. I guess that's pretty much it from our short troubleshooting topic here, what I wanted to show you from a demo perspective. Good, so that all worked, and we're close to the end of our module, and if you want the whole course, assuming that you were here since the start, but I got a couple of more topics I want to close out before literally closing out the full course, and that's the network troubleshooting. We talked about DHCP, we talked about DNS, mainly out of being one of those core Windows Server environment services. We also talked about how to migrate them, and now we're just going to bring them back in, talking a little bit like if something is wrong with those services, how can we manage them, but also how can we troubleshoot them. And then from there, touching a bit on IP configuration, which I guess is another pretty common scenario, together with routing, which means like my network looks okay, but I cannot communicate my servers, or I cannot communicate from my client to the server like a remote management, or my web server cannot communicate with a database server and the other way around. So that's another specific problem where we actually go back to one of the tools I already mentioned at the start of the course, and that's Azure Network Watcher. So same style as some of the previous topics, like one little slide placeholder to just set the scene on. These are the most common problems that we see in, like in this case, DHCP, and how to troubleshoot. Now, first of all, DHCP, taking a little step back, DHCP is not supported in Azure virtual machines. Why not? The reasoning behind it is that you should use like Azure Virtual Networking, where you preferably would use the dynamic IP addressing. So that's where DHCP and Azure VNets are not really working well together. It also means that the troubleshooting here is mainly pointing to your on-prem running DHCP servers. You're going to open up your DHCP, or in this case, the other network service or popular one is DNS, where you're going to open up your DNS manager. You're going to look into the data. If the data is not consistent across multiple DNS servers, you might look into like Event Viewer, pulling up the specific DNS server logs, and then checking, trying to find out like where can we go in and fix the problem. Now, what does that mean, right? A lot of different options here. So thinking about like some command line options, you could use NSLookup. It's a baked-in TCP/IP stack on the Windows platform, baked-in little tool where you're going to run NSLookup, and that's performing a DNS check for you. It could communicate with your internal network DNS servers, and if you want, you could also connect to like more public-facing DNS servers, like from like an internet provider. You can use DNS CMD, it's like managing DNS from a command line perspective instead of using the DNS manager. Same for ipconfig, the good old ipconfig, I would say, where you might check what's the subnet, what's my IP address, what's the gateway, can I ping to another server to just validate if the network communication is working fine. Now, just the IP configuration itself, again, brings in a lot of different troubleshooting capabilities. ipconfig itself is what you would use to list up your current IP settings. You're going to use ping as a traditional command to validate communication from one server to the other. Now, it's using what we call the ICMP protocol, which means that you need to open it up on the firewall to allow that communication to go through. So it might be that, let's say you connect to a web server and you open up port 8443 on the firewall, but you're not opening up the ICMP port, that a ping might fail, but the HTTP, HTTPS communication could still be working fine. A few other options on the right-hand side is bringing in some of the same command line built-in tools, but also using them from within like a PowerShell scripting scenario, which means that you could run scheduled tasks, you could run more detailed sequences of troubleshooting steps out of a single PowerShell script. When we touch on networking, the other part is also routing. So routing means that your endpoint, your server, maybe server and client communication, needs to hop to different network segments, where we traditionally going to use the subnet mask to identify what is part of this little network. And then if I need to connect to another network, it's going to use the gateway. So a lot of different parameters, and I would say it's based on traditional TCP/IP concepts, where you could use IPv4, IPv6. It's all based on the same TCP/IP and just validating routing problems. I would say most common scenarios here when routing goes wrong is or the subnet mask or the gateway or the firewall. Those are like the three common challenging points, I would say, if routing is not working as it should be. If you need to drill down even more in detail to figure out like what's actually happening on that lower network stack, like the TCP/IP packet level, that's where you could use Packet Monitor. Now, Packet Monitor is just an overall, I would say, generic term to look into the network packets, like literally unwrapping what is the source, what is the target, and what is the network protocol that we need in between. The good news is that Azure Network Watcher, that we talked about in one of our first modules in the course, is also allowing you to do that package management. But Network Watcher gives you a lot more on top of that. You can use it to diagnose DNS. You can use it to diagnose IP configuration as well as IP routing. And again, if worst case scenario, if needed, you can run a packet capture and then analyzing it and really trying to find out and troubleshoot why communication from one virtual machine to another or to a gateway is not working as it should be. With all that, I'm going to jump to one of my last demos actually, how to diagnose DNS problems, a little bit on the command line side, and then showing you what it looks like from Network Watcher, doing the same for IP configuration, and then closing with a demo on using that Packet Monitor, again out of Network Watcher. So I guess part of this next demo will be pretty straightforward. If you've been using or administering Windows servers for quite a while, then most of these command tools will be quite familiar. So let me start with the most obvious one to troubleshoot connectivity, and that would be ipconfig, reading out the IP information from your client. So you could do ipconfig. It's going to give you a short view of IPv4, IPv6, where maybe the subnet mask and gateway could be relevant information. If you do ipconfig /all, it's going to give you more information. So in this case, it tells you like this is a virtual machine on a hypervisor, IPv6, IPv4 information, and again, more information about your default gateway, maybe DNS servers. Like in this case, since it's the domain controller, it's IPv6 localhost. That's what we have here. We also touched on some DNS troubleshooting. So what we can do here is NS lookup, and that's connecting to like the name server validation, where now you can provide a name. Still something that I like about a DNS and Active Directory is finding out like what's the DNS host, or if you have multiple ones, it's going to list up all of them just by doing NS lookup and the name of your Active Directory domain. So when I do my mttdemodomain.com, it's going to tell me like, well, the DNS host for this domain is the 172.16. And then you can do the opposite. If I do 172.16.0.100, it's going to tell me like, well, this is the DNS name of that server. Where here you can see this is actually the internal Azure name. You can do external resolving as well. So if I do 8.8.8.8, it's going to tell me that it's the DNS from Google. So pretty easy, pretty convenient. Another one in DNS is DNS command. So that's a built-in tool inside Windows as well, where you can see you got a whole set of options allowing you to interact with your DNS. Like DNS zones, you can actually automate DNS creation or zone creation, creating records all using DNS CMD. Another relevant one could be netstat, and that's going to list up the network ports that your server is using. So like in this case, I got SMB running on the server 445. I have a web server running on some weird port that I used for one of my other migration demos. And that's really, again, what it shows you, IPv4, IPv6. So an easy scenario to validate if the server is actually, or the service on the server is actually running. Tracert is another tool where it allows you to trace IP addresses, like resolving how many hops, like the subnet mask and gateway could be one of the root causes there where something is not running as it should be. So I could do tracert and then connecting to like a Google DNS. And then here it's now going to try and connect from the local virtual machine through my subnet gateway, maybe through different hops, and then eventually telling me this is how you get to your end station. While all this is running, again, I'm running this on an Azure VM, but obviously it's not Azure related. It's all virtual machine. So this could run on-prem, this could run hybrid. With that, I'm going to close this out and talking a bit about Network Watcher. Now, Network Watcher is that network monitoring capability in the Azure platform, allowing you to troubleshoot from a network perspective. Because you got Azure VNets, you got the subnets, and then maybe you want to validate what's working with your system, what is not working. So the highlight of Network Watcher is that you don't need to deploy it. It's part of the platform. And you can run IP flow verify, where it's going to allow you to do about the same what I showed you with tracert in the command line, and telling, maybe identifying why communication from the server to the outside or the other way around is not allowed, and highlighting the NSG rule that's blocking you. You can drill down on more NSG diagnostics. If you have VPNs in place, you can run VPN troubleshooting, and then you could also do packet capture, a little bit like the traditional Wireshark, if you should be familiar with that. So let me show you what IP flow verify looks like. So you select the source server, the network interface if you have more, and then you can do inbound, outbound, TCP, UDP. So I could do outbound from my local machine. Let's do port 53, like a DNS request. Remote IP would be the same as I did in the terminal, and that would be port 53 as well. From there, we're going to verify, and it's going to tell us if it's allowed or not, and then also the reason why it might or might not be allowed. So the outcome of this access is allowed, and the reason behind it is my default security rule, allow internet outbound. Well, now if I do the opposite, or let's do an outbound. On port 22. Running the verify again. We can now validate the response, and it's telling us like access denied. And again, the reasoning is because we denied port 22 as an incoming port on our server. Package capture, I'll show you quickly how you can configure it. So the base idea is running that packet capture. So you would select your source server. What is the target? It's a virtual machine. It's my web server. The name of the packet capture, like the log file basically. Where do you want to store it? So I would recommend storing it in a storage account. And that means that you don't have it inside the VM, which to me always feels a bit weird when they select local file storage, because that's going to move inside the virtual machine. Where typically, when do you need packet capture? Typically when something is wrong with the server and you need to use that logging and really get the insights on the IP packets. You select your storage account. And then from there, you can do a continuous capture, which I would not recommend. Only during like real-time troubleshooting, that would be beneficial. But apart from that, you could also define other limitations. You start packet capture, and from there, it's going to create those log files. And again, if you use Wireshark as the on-prem, maybe hybrid management tool, know that the packet capture outcome file, like the WCAP file, is 100% compatible with Wireshark. So that's pretty much it on this part of the demo, where we talked about troubleshooting, IP config, networking, some DNS tools, showed you what Bastion is about, and then also talked about the Network Watcher packet capture. So that we're at the end of this module, monitoring troubleshooting, where the highlight was how to look at this topic from within an Azure perspective. So we touched on monitoring server virtual machines, running VMs in Azure and using primarily Azure Monitor, talking about some more advanced Azure monitoring capabilities, where I positioned Azure Log Analytics. We talked about virtual machine insights, and then out of the monitoring complexity, also bringing in what it means to troubleshoot. Troubleshooting Windows Azure virtual machines. We talked about the boot diagnostics, we talked about the logging, and then last, closing with a few hybrid networking and maybe on-prem networking troubleshooting tips and tricks. With that, we're at the end of this module, and at the same time, we're at the end of this course, where first of all, I would like to thank you for having been here with me. If it was only this module, I hope you got out of it what you expected. If you've been here with me for the whole sequence, then I would say, I hope this is going to help you in becoming, maybe remaining, a good Azure admin together with a Windows Server admin in an on-prem scenario, hybrid or 100% Azure virtual machine running environment. If you think about certification, one of the pieces of information I talked about all the way at the start, like introducing the course, I hope out of like watching all these videos, and I know it's a lot of content, it might have helped you to really get into that certification mindset, proving to yourself that you know what it means to be that cloud admin, Azure admin, Windows Server admin. If you go like, well, I don't think I'm totally ready for that, I need to study a little bit more, there's only one place I would recommend you to go to, and that's learn.microsoft.com. With that, I'm going to close out. And again, once more, thanking you for having been here with me for the course, or maybe just for this module. Any option is fine, whatever works for you. I was a trainer, and my goal is helping you understanding technical skills, moving up your skill set to become better in what you're already doing. So with that, I would like to say thank you so much and hope to see you in one of our other courses.